Hello class, we are here to talk about 9-8 today. We're going to be solving equations by factoring. Let's get started. So we have two learning objectives today. Our first learning objective, we are going to find the zeros of a function. We also need to talk about what the zeros of a function are. And second, we're going to solve equations by factoring. Let's go ahead and get started. So, the zeros of a function. What the zeros of a function are the x values that make our function value 0. So if we look at this function, for instance, we have y is equal to x minus 2 and times x minus 4. We are saying that the zeros of those two functions would be 2 and 4. They are called the zeros of the function because the value of the function is 0 when these numbers are substituted for x. Let's see what that looks like graphically. So we go to our good friend Desmos. I went ahead and graphed this function. If we focus in here, you'll see that it makes that parabola shape and that we have zeros at 2 and 4. And what that means by zeros is the function value, or y value, the output, is 0 when x equals 2. Okay? The function value, the y value, the output is 0 when x equals 4. So therefore, the zeros of the function are 2 and 4. That's what we mean by zeros. Now, how do we find those zeros? To find those zeros, we're going to use something called the zero product property. And here's what the zero product property tells me. What the zero product property tells me is that if we have two numbers, a and b, and we multiply them together and the result is 0, it must be true that either a and or b are 0. Think about it. Try to think of two numbers that you can multiply together that aren't 0, where the result ends up being 0. Probably can't think of any. In order to get 0 as a result, when we multiply two numbers together, one of these two numbers needs to be 0. Now, here's how we're going to use that. Let's say we want to find the zeros of this function. So the function they give us is y is equal to the quantity x plus 2 times x minus 3. And let's say we want to find the zeros. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take our function here. X plus 2 and x minus 3. And we are going to set that equal to 0. Now, here's the thing. We have two numbers here, okay? Our first number is the quantity x plus 2. I'm going to highlight that in yellow. And we're going to call that the yellow number. Our second quantity is the quantity x minus 3. Okay? Our number here, the quantity x minus 3, I'm going to highlight in blue. We're going to call that the blue number. Now here's the thing. If we multiply the yellow number times the blue number, and our result is 0, it must be true that either the yellow number or the blue number is 0. So my question is this. What value of x makes the yellow number 0? Hopefully you can see it by looking at it. But here's what we do instead. We take our yellow number, x plus 2, and we set it equal to 0. And let's go ahead and solve. Let's go ahead and solve. In order to solve this, I would subtract 2 from both sides, leaving me with x is equal to negative 2. So negative 2 is one of the zeros of this function, because if we plug that back in, negative 2 plus 2 is 0, negative 2 minus 3 is negative 5, but 0 times negative 5 equals 0. Now, that's not the only number that gives us a 0 of the function, though. So what we need to do now is we're going to need to set the blue number equal to 0 and solve. In order to solve, I go ahead and I add 3 to both sides, leaving me with x is equal to 3. That is the 0 of this function, because let's see what happens when we plug it in. If we plug in 3 here, we get 3 plus 2 is 5. We plug it in here, we get 3 minus 3 is 0. 5 times 0 equals 0. So the two x values that make the function equal to 0 are negative 2 and 3. Hence, those are the zeros of our function. And that's how we find zeros, using that zero product property. Let's keep going. You will also see problems that say solve, okay? Solve by factoring. Let's go ahead and solve this one by factoring. So negative 16x squared plus 96x is equal to 0. Now, in order to do our factoring, we need to consider that factoring flowchart we've been talking about. So first, is my expression written in standard form? Yes, it is. Second, can we factor out a greatest common factor? Well, I believe we can. You'll notice we have a negative 16x squared, and a 96x. Let's go ahead and factor out, since I don't like the first term to be negative after we factor. Let's factor out a negative 16x. Negative 16x times x gives me negative 16x squared. Negative 16x times negative 6 gives me positive 96x. And here we find ourselves in a similar position to the last problem. We have a yellow number times a blue number that equals 0. And of course, if yellow number times blue number equals 0, then either yellow number needs to be 0 or blue number needs to be 0. Let's find the values of x that make those equal to 0. Let's start with the yellow number. Negative 16x, what makes it 0? Well, let's find out by setting it equal to 0. To solve for x, I would just divide both sides by negative 16, leaving me with x equals 0. So 0 is a 0 of the function, meaning if I plug in 0 for x, the function equals 0. To find our other 0, we set our other number equal to 0, so x minus 6 is equal to 0. This one's easy enough to solve. I just simply need to add 6 to both sides, leaving me with x equals 6. So the two values that make this function equal to 0 are 0 and 6. Want me to prove it to you? Why not? Negative 16x squared plus 96x. Let's see what that looks like when we plug it into our good friend Desmos. So, give me the keyboard. Let's go ahead and plug this in. Negative 16x squared plus 96x. Oh, this one looks crazy. But the point remains the same. Where is the vertex of this thing? It's all over the place. The point is the same. Where this function is equal to 0 is when x equals 0 and when x equals 6. Therefore, those are the two zeros of the function. Great. Just for a couple more examples, let's go ahead and solve these two very quickly. So let's start with example A here. We have x squared plus 5x minus 24 equals 0. So we want to factor the left side of the equation here. Factors of negative 24 that add to 5 would be a positive 8 and a negative 3. I then just set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So x plus 8 equals 0. Let's go ahead and solve that. Subtract 8 from both sides. X equals negative 8. I then set my other factor equals 0. X minus 3 equal to 0. Add 3 to both sides. X is equal to 3. So my zeros are x is equal to negative 8 and x is equal to 3. If you were to graph that on Desmos, you would see that the parabola crosses the x-axis at negative 8 and 3. And finally, this example B, 4x squared plus x minus 5 equals 0. Unfortunately, this one isn't as easy to factor as the other one because we have that value for a other than 1. So I'm going to go ahead and use guess and check. Let's see if I can figure this out fast. Let's see. So factors of -5, I can either have -1 times 5 or 5 times -1. I'm thinking we plug in a 5 here and a -1 here. 4x times x is 4x squared, minus 4x plus 5x is 1. 5 times -1 is -5. You may need to box method this one to factor. Whatever method you like better, go for that. But for today's lesson, what we're worried about is finding the zero. So what we need to do now is set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So 4x plus 5 is equal to 0. Okay, because that's our first factor, our yellow number. Subtract 5 from both sides. That leaves me with 4x is equal to -5. Divide both sides by 4. That leaves me with x is equal to -5/4. For our other 0, we take our other number, we're going to call this one the blue number, and we set it equal to 0 and solve. So, add 1 to both sides, that leaves me with x is equal to 1. So my two zeros in this case would be -5/4 and 1. If you were to graph this on Desmos, the parabola would cross the x-axis at -1.25 and at 1. That is how you solve to find the zeros, people. Let's go ahead and look back at our objectives for today. Oh no, I went all the way. Oh no. Let's see how fast Mr. Lynch can figure this out on the fly. Oh no. Almost there. Almost there. 90. So we found the zeros of a function. Again, you can graph the parabola and see where it crosses the x-axis. Those are your zeros. We will be talking about how to graph parabolas in the next chapter. But we also find it by factoring and solving, which I think is the better option. So that is 9-8. That's the end of chapter 9. Make sure to review really hard for that test, and we'll talk to you soon.